What is most important for healing? Is it being the most theological in the world? No. Is it being without sin? No. Is it by keeping laws? No. It's one thing. And by the way, when Zane and Tony figured this thing out, their life changed. If you believe in the gospel, then you believe in healing. The gospel is plain and simple healing. Join Tony Myers, a former atheist who was miraculously healed of terminal ALS, and now a dynamic healing evangelist, in Zane Pierre, a former Pentecostal, who proved the dynamics of the Spirit and healing through experimental research, and now a Christ pneumatologist, as they unite to bring you into experiencing plain and simple healing. If you are struggling to see the results in healing for yourself and healing for others, this broadcast is for you.
Boom!
Bam!
We are back in the house. Zane El Fuego and
Tony, Elfo Ego, the blue-haired blunder.
yeah, the hair is nice and blue again. Nice and blue again. We are back today with another episode of the Miraculous Gospel of Healing. We're changing the tone a little bit, pivoting a little bit, and we're going to speak about the garden throughout this month. All right, so I think
On the last episode, I had to wave that carrot a little bit and tantalize people.
right.
And we ended it with me saying, since there was no sin in the garden, there was no command. I know that waved some red flags with people, and they're figuring, what? Say what? I promised on the next episode we would discuss this.
Indeed, we did. Indeed.
In our effort not to disappoint,
Right.
we are going to discuss this. There was no sin in the garden. Therefore, guess what? God did not directly command, as we think from what most translations say. We are thinking that God directly gave Adam a command, do not eat from this tree. That's not true. What is true, God, through his breath, when he breathed life, he downloaded the codec. Adam being the first of the species, God downloaded his spirit into Adam. Therefore, what was going on in the garden was the firstborn determined the course of the species. So when he relied on something outside of himself in the physical world, then that, which we call it the tree or the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, as though Adam, listening to Eve and the serpent, partook of the fruit of physicality, believing his physical senses over his spirit, is where death came in and sin came in. Let's let the real scholar come in here.
No, I think you're actually spot on and in the right direction, bro. One of the things that we had to address, even in the context of how you read the garden, is addressing how we approach the Bible. Just before this episode, we were speaking about how we've identified before how Cain's way of doing things is transactional, whilst Abel's way of doing things is forsaking the animal nature and calling upon the name and reproducing that after your own kind. And most people in particular, because the Western world has been trained to think transactionally, the whole Western world is designed like that. The Greco-Roman world is designed like that. Everything that we do in the Western world is based on the idea of contract and not covenant. And there's a difference. Now, usually I would use the word contract to compare a similar dynamic. But if you look at covenant and contract, inherently, they're not the same in function. So I'll explain this so that people can actually find the frame that they're looking at the garden through and realize that they might be actually looking at it through Cain. In the Western world, for example, we work with the idea of contract. And contract means we formulate an agreement and there's always a third party to ensure that both parties keep the agreement. The whole society is designed like that. You sign agreements with the bank, you take a loan, you sign an agreement, legal agreements, business agreements, your credit cards, when you're going to the hospital, everything is based on contract. The thing about
And
contract,
if you screw it up, You sue their pants off.
Yes, sue their pants off indeed. What most people don't take into consideration with that dynamic, that construct is inherently telling you that you are an evil person and you are expected to not keep your word. They put a judge and a construct in place to bind you to your word so that you could keep your word.
And
The
that's
whole
why
society is based on that.
And that's why religious denominations, such as the Southern Baptists, believe that you have to have an overseer. You have to have someone else,
Yeah.
accountability person, to make sure you don't sin.
Right.
You have to have someone you're accountable to because the Holy Spirit is not powerful enough to force you to do it. That's why a baby cries, because it's selfish and it's evil and wicked.
They teach that?
They teach that.
Wow.
I have heard preachers give a sermon. I will prove to you you were born into sin. A baby's crying because that baby's selfish. As people, we were not born into Adam.
No, we won't. No, we won't.
But there are numerous
Wow.
highly visible preachers that preach that.
I first time I hear that.
No, for real.
That is
I'm
serious
trying
talk
to
right
think
there.
one off the top of my head. They do. And they use babies as an example to prove that you're born evil.
That is madness.
That is madness.
That's madness. Wow. Okay. Interesting. Very interesting.
We're not born into Adam anymore. And in fact, we never actually were, because, hello, have you never read that the Lamb was slain since before the foundation of the world? Have we never heard of that?
All right.
Now that I've totally disrupted your line of thought, go ahead.
All right. So what I was saying there just now is that the Western world is actually framed on a contractual framework. Right? It's framed like that so that the whole idea of viewing anything differently is not normal because this is what we know. And that context in particular is different from the idea of covenant. The idea of covenant is founded upon what we would call personal vows, right? And a personal vow is, for persons who don't know what that is, most people, they've had experiences in life at some point in time, may have had an experience that was not very pleasant, or they experienced something that impacted them, and they vow to themselves that they will do this in their life, or they will not never do this in their life. And they don't depend on anybody to validate that. They don't run that by anybody. They just commit to that, and they live by that from their heart. This is what the Bible calls covenant living, right? Naturally, the Westerner would open the God narrative and apply that perspective there and assume that everything that God is saying is a command of prohibition.
Right.
Whereas the Abel's perspective is actually living from the heart, living from what you truly think and feel and committing to that. So when they came into the name, they made a personal vow to the title and to the vision of that name. This is why I know when God speaks to Abraham in a vision, when this is the first mention of the word of God, that is in Genesis 15. Just before that, the few chapters before that, he had built an altar, done a burnt offering,
right,
so that he called upon the name. The word of God was what was the thoughts of God that was from the Spirit that was in him. And he began to be motivated, take actions motivated by that vision. And God called it righteousness. Righteousness here is not moral rectitude. It means that he is now working how he was designed to function, to be motivated from his visions. Now, if you view the narrative of the garden through that, which is what the righteousness is, this is exactly what is present in the garden. And as a matter of fact, what starts that off in the garden is, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And so because we, in the Western world, we have our understanding of what the beginning is, we attribute time alone to that.
right.
In the beginning, it has to be time. So when we think about it, we think about some time in the past that has no date, that you can't ascertain. But the scriptures in particular is not even interpreted through the Western frame of thought. They have their own system of interpretation, which is called the garden interpretation. In that garden interpretation, they use what you call hints, and hints would be whatever you're reading is hinting to a definition wherever it's actually be used in the scriptures, especially in this first mention. And one of the things that King Solomon does is that he hints to the garden narrative and he defines the beginning as wisdom, right? Which means the garden narrative, for those of you hearing this for the first time, actually can also be read. Genesis chapter 1 can also be, Genesis 1:1 can also be read in wisdom. Elohim created the heaven and the earth. Therefore, everything that is mentioned in the text is actually through the perspective of wisdom. Wisdom,
Not a command.
not a command. You see, again, in the Western world, I don't know if most people actually are aware of the fact that in the Western world, we have laws, but citizens are not educated on the laws. All right. And that's because in most cases, citizens breaking laws is a form of revenue. But we ain't getting into politics here, right? In essence, if you study law, you know that all laws are reactive. They are never proactive. The reason why it is reactive is because you cannot give a rule of prohibition unless someone has done something that is unconscionable, something that they should not do. So when they do that, then you can say that we're giving you a rule. But if the person has not done anything, it's like I'm coming to you and we have a conversation and I'm seeing, let's say, a little down the road of the plan, we could have a problem. I wouldn't give you a rule to not follow. I'd say, hey, consider this. And I would encourage you to consider this response to that. That would be me sharing a word of wisdom to you.
Right.
So that if it comes, you know which pathway to take to get the more favorable outcome. Right? So that's the difference between law and wisdom. What you're reading in the text is wisdom. The breath was breathed into the man, and the breath in the ancient Israelite culture is another way of saying the character of God was breathed into the man. And if the character of God is breathed into the man, and we're saying that there is a commandment, what we are saying is the character of God that the man received was evil.
Now, just for our audience, what my most holy brother Zane is saying is character.
Mm-hmm. All right, okay.
I just don't want anybody to be like, huh? Because y'all there in the Caribbean pronounce it different than we do.
Yeah. I just realized that.
So what Zane's saying is character of God.
Right. Yes.
I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah. That's the difference between, we in the Caribbean, we are more British influenced. So
Right.
our pronunciation vary many times. Right. So that was breathed into him. And then he begins to function from that. If anybody in particular says that it was a law in the garden, what you are saying is that God breathed Satan into the man. Because in the text, in all biblical texts, the only thing that is contradicting what God has done or what God has said would be what you call Satan. So technically, you're saying that God breathed Satan into the man and God had to give him a rule to prevent Satan from being Satan, right? So that cannot exist in the text if the garden in particular was said to be good and very good.
God looked and it was good.
It was good. Good and very good. The very tree there was good and very good.
No sin had been committed. God breathed his character into Adam, and with that came the words of wisdom.
The words of wisdom.
Did you like the way I explained it? It's a codex. What God did was breathe a codex into Adam.
You're perfectly right. I love the word that you actually use to define it as well. Because technically, that's what, I shouldn't say technically, that was what Moses was communicating in the text. That the garden was the codex, and that was breathed into the man, and the man was living from his nature, which was the vision of the garden. You see, most people are not aware of the fact. This is a good conversation and a good points to make here for the audience. Whilst Western science has taught you that your nature is biological, the scriptures in the garden teaches you that your nature is dependent upon your vision. You are adjusting your physical construct by your vision. So your vision, the vision that you hold is your nature. So if you, which is why when the man switches his reference point and listens to the vision of the serpent and he adopts the vision of the serpent, nature changed. So that in essence of itself means that whatever vision you are holding on to right now, you are determining your nature. You are choosing your nature. But we'll unpack that in the upcoming episode, in one of the upcoming episodes. But definitely in the garden, there was no sin. Holy Brother Tony actually mentioned the garden, the tree and the fruit. And rightfully put, we in the Western culture, we put our own frame into it and we say, well, there was an apple and there was no apple in the narrative, right? What it was that the woman looked at the tree and she saw that the tree was good to make one wise. And that's because in the ancient Hebrew, the word tree, if you go and you do some research, it represents wisdom because and they use the tree to represent wisdom, which is why she says it's good to make one wise because it's the tree represented wisdom. Two things. Number one, wisdom. The tree is actually used to refer to wisdom. In essence, you could say that it communicates that when one chooses their truth, it grows and creates many branches in their life, and every branch is a different aspect of their life, and every branch has more branches and twigs, which represents the finer aspects of all of the thoughts that you have is a multiplication of the wisdom that you chose. And some of us, we chose it when we were teens or when we were 8 years of age. You forgot about it. And now psychology calls it your subconscious mind, but it's the wisdom that you choose.
Or your program.
Or is your program.
What you've
right?
programmed in that you're no longer aware of because it's on autopilot.
So you forget where you got where you get the vision from. Now everything is responding to that vision, and you're only aware of your feelings. But feelings do not self-generate; they are a response to a way of thinking, right? And the second thing is this might actually also ruffle some feathers. Wisdom is the same thing as saying the knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil and wisdom are synonyms, which means the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was a form of wisdom. The question is, what is the source of your wisdom? And what the source of your wisdom is the vision that you choose to make your source of truth, right? This is why the script, the New Testament authors, the disciples, even the Apostle Paul, they speak about discipline in your mind according to what God has said, which is God's vision, right? So the garden in particular was that vision breathed into the man, and therefore he was actually functioning from the garden as his wisdom. Without corruption, there can be no laws, only wisdom.
And the laws, which what we view as the laws of the law of Moses,
right,
was actually the intention of God was wisdom.
100. But the text says that in Deuteronomy 4. It says, "This shall be your wisdom."
They turned it into law and commands. So what the Western mind doesn't even realize, the 10 Commandments were nothing but prefaces of wisdom.
Yes.
Prefaces of wisdom.
Yes. 100.
And the Jews turned it into commandments, turned it into punishment. That, and I feel in a large part, the Western world used this misrepresentation as the foundation for the Western world.
Right.
Chose the wrong foundation.
And this, by the way, is what Jesus was combating with the Pharisees, because the Pharisees had a problem with wisdom. They wouldn't like the fact that Jesus was treating the law as though it's just guidelines. So he walks and he have his disciples picking wheat on the Sabbath, and they want to know why you're breaking the Sabbath. He uses David as his reference point here to give context to the fact that David came from war and entered into the temple and eat the bread that the priest supposed to eat, and God didn't hold him responsible. And the difference between this again comes down to the Pharisees. When you fall out of the covenant, you fall from Abel's perspective into Cain's perspective. So the Pharisees naturally started to use the law as a transaction, and we do this to get this. Whilst Jesus is functioning from covenant, and covenant is I commit in my heart to fulfill God's vision. If you commit to fulfill God's vision, let me take a breath before I release this right here. If you look at scripture, do you know that Abraham lied? He lied to Pharaoh concerning his wife. Do you know Jesus lied? Jesus told his brothers that he was not going let them go, he let them go to Jerusalem, and then he went up after. By definition, we could say that was a lie. Now that right there already shaking real people's brain, right? Because by definition, we could say that he lied. None of them, but neither Abraham nor Jesus was really held responsible for that.
Nor Isaac.
No Isaac, yeah, they weren't held responsible for that. Why? Because in contractual thinking, you think you need to do things to get something. You are looking at it that Jesus is actually coming from the perspective that he has to live right for God to be with him. The covenantal perspective is he commits to the vision in his heart. And if he commits to the vision in his heart, then you are not committing to transaction, you're committing to living from God, living towards God's vision, or living to fulfill God's vision rather, to establish it on the earth from your heart. That is the same thing as someone who goes to a company, they're given an induction, they're told this is the company's vision, and they want you to live towards that vision. If you make mistakes, it's not called sin. It's called you gaining more wisdom towards making this vision happen. This is why it says that Jesus grew in wisdom. Because if you're committed, if the oath is committed to a vision, that person's life is geared towards that vision. Their routine, all of the decisions is geared towards that vision. If they make a mistake or they do something that is out of the way, is in the context of the scriptures, the covenant does not deem it sin. Or the script, the book of Proverbs, it says the righteous falls 7 times and gets up. It didn't say that the righteous sins. It falls 7 times. Once you're committed to the vision, what you do, notice Abraham sinned according to Western culture. He lied, which is a sin. And God made the man that he lied to sterile. That ought to destroy your transactional doctrine right there. So
He held Pharaoh
responsible. Why? Because this is not a transactional thing as you think. Abraham commits to the vision. And even though Abraham does something that you might think in transactional thinking is wrong, his vision is committing to the spirit. And therefore, everything that he's doing is filled with spirit.
Would it be fair to say that Pharaoh violated his own spirit by that? And that is why there was punishment.
But it is only by the law of reproduction after your own kind can one actually understand that. Because we have been seeing it all along. For decades, the Bible has been taught from the perspective of do this and you get this. And this is not how the covenant works. It never worked like that. The covenant is basically functions where one makes a personal vow to the title and to the vision, and God makes that vow to himself. First mention of that vow is actually with I think Genesis 28 with Isaac, who makes a personal vow to God. God makes a personal vow to him first. And what the vow was on God's integrity, which means Isaac could fall 100 times and God is still going to fulfill that vow. And Isaac made the vow. Now, from that perspective, when one makes a vow, one focuses their heart on fulfilling that vow. You are not measuring the next person. This is what the book of Job was actually demonstrating. What it means to live in a personal vow. That no matter what happens, you live according to your vow and know that God is living according to his vow too. So no matter what happens, we're going to come out of this. This is what the virtuous woman is, why the virtuous woman is called the virtuous woman. The wicked woman is the woman who is measuring. The virtuous woman is the woman who is committed to the marriage by a vow in her heart that while the husband doing what he's doing, she's not comparing. She vowed to this in her heart and she's fulfilling it according to her own integrity. This is what biblical covenant is about.
State, if your own heart, if your own conscience, and then you violate it.
Exactly.
The violation of your own conscience is sin.
Exactly.
It spells it out.
All over the New Testament, but we don't live from that perspective. So you have Western doctrine creating one set of nice fancy doctrines and coming up with all kinds of different perspectives, but it's all based on vow to your own heart. The vowing to yourself was making a vow to the name, vow to God. So if you break that, you see, the vow in particular represented how the man was created in the garden. In the same way, gravity does not break. In the same way, vowing to yourself is something that you don't break. So you could say that if you call that gravity physics, then you could call a vow to your heart physics as well. It shouldn't be broken. And that, by the way, is what Moses starts to call sin. you're in dysfunction. You're violating your own spirit. So let me not add anything on top of that because see, we're on time,
After Moses, the Israelis start losing their way and start losing the sight because their focus gets on the wrong thing. That's where they start viewing it as a contract with God
Transaction.
being the third party and with God being the punisher.
Yeah.
And hence the god Zeus is then born.
Yeah.
And the pie in the sky god is then born. Along comes the Gentiles, the pagans, the Western mindset that has no idea whatsoever, and they steal the Torah and they try to make it their own
Make it the contractual one. Yeah.
with the wrong mindset, with a contractual mindset, with God being the third party. He's the judge now. And instead of being a restorative judge because we're under contract, he's the judge that decides who's guilty.
Yeah. Yeah.
And everybody's got to be guilty. There has to be a guilty party.
Because that's the nature of the system of transaction. There has to be something that's the only way it could make sense in a transactional perspective. And by the way, this all ties into healing. And that's why most people struggle to actually get and see the establishment of their body being brought back into oneness.
And once again, because they look at healing as
Transactionally.
contractual.
Yeah, that's why they're doing it. When healing, watch Job. Watch Job. Job functioned from the oath. That's why his wife could tell him, curse God and guy, and he's not going to listen to that.
Right.
His friends came with transactional thinking, and God rebuked them after. And living by the oath is the same thing as saying living by integrity. That's why integrity is a strong theme in Job. Now, once you understand that, then you understand that Job living by that name is how he was healed. Integrity to that, oath to that, no transaction. And this is how Jesus approached the covenant as well. That's why Jesus is actually combating the transactional thinking of these Pharisees because they're messing up the people.
Be blessed.
Be healed.
And be a blessing. Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, what an inspiring and thought-provoking episode, delving into the core of healing and its profound connection to the gospel. If you've ever wondered about the true essence of healing, you're not alone. Tony Myers and Zane Pierre have shared their powerful insights on how understanding one fundamental principle transformed their lives. It's clear from our conversation that healing isn't about being the most theological or living a sinless life, nor is it about adhering to a strict set of laws. So as we wrap up today's episode, I encourage you to reflect on the insights shared by our incredible hosts. Thank you for joining us today, and remember, be blessed, be healed, and be a blessing.